There are sins so dark that the people who commit them spend the rest of their lives running, not from the law, not from society, but from God Himself. They hide in crowds, bury themselves in work, drown their guilt in bottles and pills, anything to escape the weight of divine judgment pressing down on their souls. This is the story of Antonio Salvatore, a man who committed an act so unforgivable that he believed even confession couldn't save him. A man who walked into churches and felt the walls closing in, who heard prayers and felt them like acid on his skin. A man whose soul was so consumed by darkness that he learned to hide from God Himself, until the day he encountered Padre Pio. What happened in that monastery in 1952 wasn't just a confession. It was a spiritual battle between a soul determined to remain hidden and a saint who could see through every wall, every lie, every shadow where sin tries to hide. If you've ever wondered if redemption is possible for the unredeemable, hit that subscribe button, because this story will challenge everything you believe about forgiveness, judgment, and the relentless love that pursues us even when we run. Let me take you to the moment Antonio's world shattered, the night he became a man in hiding. Antonio Salvatore had been a good man once, a school teacher in Naples, loved by his students, respected in his community. He taught literature and history, believing that education could lift people out of poverty and darkness. He went to Mass every Sunday. He donated to the poor. He was, by every measure society could offer, righteous. That was before the war changed everything. It was 1943. Nazi forces occupied Naples. The Gestapo demanded lists, names of families hiding Jews, partisan sympathizers, anyone who might threaten their control. The local fascist officials pressured teachers, priests, shop owners. Cooperate or face consequences. Antonio refused. For months, he refused. Then they arrested his wife, Juliana. They brought Antonio to a cold stone room in a commandeered government building. An SS officer placed a pen and paper before him. 7 names. That's all we need. 7 families, and your wife goes home tonight. Refuse, and she'll be on tomorrow's train to Dachau. Through the wall, Antonio could hear Juliana weeping. He tried to pray, tried to summon the courage of martyrs he'd taught his students about. But all he could hear was his wife's terrified sobs. All he could imagine was her emaciated body in some distant camp, dying alone, cursing his name. So Antonio wrote the names. 7 families, 23 people total. He knew them all. The Cohens, who ran the bakery. The Rossetti family, whose son had been his student. The elderly Levis, who had nowhere else to hide. Juliana came home that night. They held each other and wept. 3 days later, the Gestapo raided every address on Antonio's list. 23 people were dragged from their hiding places. Antonio watched from his window as the Cohens were forced into trucks, their daughter, barely 8 years old, screaming for her mother. None of them survived the camps. When the war ended and the truth came out, Antonio wasn't prosecuted. The chaos of liberation meant many collaborators escaped justice. But his neighbors knew. The whispers followed him everywhere. Juliana couldn't bear to look at him. She took her own life in 1946, leaving a note with only 3 words: "I forgive you." But Antonio couldn't forgive himself. He stopped teaching, stopped going to church. He moved from city to city, working menial jobs, trying to outrun the ghosts. Every night he saw their faces, the families he'd condemned. Every night he heard that little girl screaming. And every time he tried to pray, every time he attempted confession, he felt something he couldn't explain, a wall between himself and God, as if his soul had learned to hide so deep that even heaven couldn't reach it. Until a stranger in a tavern told him about a monk in San Giovanni Rotondo who could see souls the way others see faces. Antonio arrived in San Giovanni Rotondo on a freezing January morning in 1952, 7 years after the war had ended. 7 years of running. He didn't come seeking redemption. He came because he needed to know if what people said about Padre Pio was true, that this Capuchin friar could see into souls, could read sins like books, could peer through the darkness that Antonio had wrapped around himself like armor. If Padre Pio could see him, truly see him, then maybe God could too. And if God could see him, then Antonio would finally have his answer. Was he beyond salvation? Part of him hoped he was. Damnation felt more honest than forgiveness. The monastery town was packed with pilgrims, thousands of them, camping in the streets, waiting days for a chance to confess to the stigmatized priest. Antonio rented a room in a crumbling pensione and watched the crowds from his window, chain-smoking cigarettes, his hands shaking. An elderly woman in the next room, Signora Benedetta, knocked on his door that evening with bread and wine. "You look like you haven't eaten in days, Filio." Antonio accepted out of politeness, though the food tasted like ash in his mouth. "Are you here for Padre Pio?" she asked. "I don't know why I'm here." She studied him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge. "I was like you once, carrying something so heavy I thought it would crush me. I tried 3 times to confess to him. 3 times I turned back at the church door." "What stopped you?" "Fear, not of judgment, but of being truly known." She poured him wine. "When you stand before Padre Pio, there's nowhere to hide. He doesn't see you the way people see you. He sees you the way God sees you. Every wound, every scar, every sin you've buried so deep you've almost convinced yourself it didn't happen." Antonio's cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers. "And you went through with it?" "The 4th time, yes. And it destroyed me." She smiled, and it was the saddest, most beautiful expression Antonio had ever seen. "But it also rebuilt me into something that could finally live again." That night, Antonio couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to pilgrims singing hymns in the streets below. He thought about Juliana's suicide note. "I forgive you." Words he'd never believed. At 3 a.m., he got out of bed and walked to the monastery. The doors were locked, the church silent. Antonio pressed his forehead against the cold wood. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered to the darkness. From inside, though no one should have been there, a voice responded. "But you will." Antonio stood frozen at those monastery doors, heart pounding. The voice had been real, deep, accented, unmistakably from inside the locked church. But when he tried the handle again, it wouldn't budge. He stumbled back to the pensione, convinced he was losing his mind. Dawn came with church bells that shook the entire hillside. Antonio joined the river of pilgrims flowing toward Santa Maria delle Grazie. The crowd was massive. Hundreds of desperate souls pressing toward the church entrance, some weeping, some praying aloud, all seeking the stigmatized priest who could work miracles. Antonio let himself be carried by the current of bodies. He told himself he was just observing, just seeing what the fuss was about. But as he crossed the threshold into the church, something inside him recoiled violently. It felt like walking into fire, not physical heat, something deeper, a burning that started in his chest and spread through his entire being. Antonio gasped, stumbling, clutching a pew for support. Around him, other pilgrims moved freely, peacefully, but Antonio felt like his very soul was being exposed to light after years of darkness. He turned to flee. "Antonio Salvatore." The voice stopped him dead. He turned slowly. Padre Pio stood 30 feet away near the altar, surrounded by monks and pilgrims. He wasn't looking at Antonio. He was hearing confession from an elderly woman. But Antonio felt the priest's awareness of him like a physical touch, as if invisible hands were holding him in place. "Antonio Salvatore," Padre Pio repeated without turning. "The man who hides." Every person in the church fell silent. All eyes turned to Antonio. He tried to speak, but his throat constricted. The burning sensation intensified. And then something inexplicable happened. Antonio felt his soul trying to retreat deeper into himself, like an animal burrowing into the earth. He'd done this before, countless times, whenever guilt threatened to surface. He'd learned to push his sin down, to bury it beneath layers of distraction and denial. But now, with Padre Pio's attention on him, those layers were being peeled away like old wallpaper. Antonio could feel the priest's spiritual vision penetrating every defense, every wall, reaching toward the darkness Antonio had protected for 7 years. "No." Antonio's voice was hoarse. "I'm not ready." He turned and ran. Out of the church, through the crowd, down the hillside, his lungs burning, his legs carrying him as far as they could. He didn't stop until he reached an abandoned stone shelter a mile from town, collapsing against the wall, sobbing. But even there, in the wilderness, Antonio felt it. Padre Pio's gaze, still searching, still seeing, pursuing him through the spiritual realm like a hunter tracking prey. There was nowhere left to hide. Antonio spent 3 days in that stone shelter, surviving on rainwater and wild berries. He told himself he'd leave San Giovanni Rotondo, return to his nomadic existence, forget about the priest who could see too much. But he couldn't move. His legs refused. His body had become a prison. On the 3rd night, shivering with cold and hunger, Antonio heard footsteps. A young Capuchin monk appeared in the entrance, carrying bread, cheese, and a wool blanket. He looked barely 20, with kind eyes that held no judgment. "Padre Pio sent me," the monk said simply. "He knew you'd be here." Antonio's laugh was bitter. "Of course he did." "He wants you to know something." The monk knelt beside Antonio, offering the food. "You think you're hiding from God, but what you're really doing is hiding from yourself, and it's killing you. You don't understand what I've done. Padre Pio does. He saw it all the moment you entered the church. The names, the families, the little girl screaming." The monk's voice was gentle, without accusation. "He saw your wife's death. He saw every night you've spent trying to bury it. and he saw something else. Antonio looked up, tears streaming down his face. What? He saw that your soul has been trying to confess for 7 years, but you've built walls so high that even your own prayers can't escape. You're not hiding from God's judgment, Antonio. You're hiding from His mercy. Because mercy requires you to face what you've done, and you're more terrified of forgiveness than damnation. The words hit Antonio like a hammer blow, because they were true. He'd told himself he couldn't confess because his sin was too great. But the real reason was simpler and more devastating. If God forgave him, then he'd have to forgive himself. And Antonio Salvatore had decided 7 years ago that he didn't deserve forgiveness. He'd made his guilt into an identity, his shame into a shield, and now he was trapped inside it, slowly suffocating. Padre Pio says there's still time, the monk continued. But you have to choose. Keep running and die inside these walls you've built, or come back tomorrow morning. Face him. Face yourself. Face God. The monk left the supplies and departed into the darkness. Antonio sat alone, the bread untouched in his lap, staring at his hands. The same hands that had written those 7 names. The same hands that could have chosen differently. As dawn broke over the Gargano Mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Antonio Salvatore made his decision. He would return to the monastery, not to hide, but to be seen. Antonio walked back to Santa Maria delle Grazie at dawn, his steps heavy as a condemned man approaching the gallows. The church was nearly empty at this hour, just a handful of early pilgrims lighting candles in the dim sanctuary. But Padre Pio was there, kneeling before the altar, hands folded in prayer, the wounds of his stigmata visible even from a distance. He didn't turn when Antonio entered, didn't acknowledge him. But Antonio felt the shift in the air, the way the spiritual atmosphere seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. "I'm here," Antonio said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know." Padre Pio rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and gestured toward the confessional. "Come." Antonio's legs trembled as he crossed the church. Every step felt like walking deeper underwater, pressure building in his chest. He entered the confessional booth, knelt on the worn wood, and faced the screen that separated him from the priest. Padre Pio settled on the other side. In the shadows, Antonio could see his weathered face, those penetrating eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Antonio's voice cracked. "It has been 7 years since my last confession." Silence. Then Padre Pio spoke, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. "You don't need to tell me what you did, Antonio. I already know. What you need to tell me is why you believe you're beyond God's reach." Antonio's carefully constructed defenses began to crack. "Because I chose my wife over 23 innocent people. I sent children to death camps to save one person I loved. What kind of man does that? A terrified one. A human one. That's not good enough." Antonio's voice rose, anger and anguish pouring out. "I was supposed to be better. I taught children about courage and sacrifice and moral duty, and when it mattered, I failed. I condemned them all." "Yes." Padre Pio's honesty was brutal and compassionate simultaneously. You did, and you've spent 7 years making sure that sin was the last word of your story, building walls around it, protecting it, worshiping it like a false god. Antonio felt something break inside him. The walls he'd built were crumbling, and behind them was a grief so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. "I can't carry this anymore," he sobbed. "I can't." "Then put it down." And in that moment, Padre Pio did something no other priest had ever done. He reached through the confessional screen and took Antonio's face in his stigmata-marked hands. "Look at me, Antonio, and see what God sees." Padre Pio's hands were warm despite the blood seeping through his gloves. Antonio felt the stigmata wounds against his cheeks, physical proof of Christ's suffering pressed against his own face, and something inside him finally surrendered. "Close your eyes," Padre Pio commanded gently. Antonio obeyed, and then he saw what the priest saw. It wasn't a vision in the traditional sense. It was more like being pulled outside of his own body, outside of time itself, and seeing his life from a perspective that wasn't his own. He saw himself in that Nazi interrogation room, but now he could see more. He saw the terror coursing through his veins. He saw his heart literally breaking as he heard Juliana weeping. He saw his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen. And he saw something else. He saw angels weeping. God was there, Antonio. Padre Pio's voice echoed through the vision. In that room, in your agony, he didn't abandon you. Then why didn't he stop me? Because love doesn't force. Love doesn't override the terrible gift of free will. But love was there, suffering with you, carrying the weight of an impossible choice that should never have existed. The vision shifted. Antonio saw the families being arrested, saw the little Cohen girl screaming, and he expected to see God's wrath, God's judgment. Instead, he saw something that shattered him completely. He saw himself, his soul, reaching toward those families even as they were dragged away. Saw his spiritual hands trying desperately to pull them back, to undo what he'd done. Saw his soul screaming in anguish, tearing itself apart with grief. You think you've been hiding from God, Padre Pio said. But what you've really been hiding from is this: the part of you that never stopped mourning. The part that's been on its knees begging for forgiveness since the moment you signed those names. Your soul never stopped praying, Antonio. You just couldn't hear it anymore through all the walls you built. Antonio was sobbing now, deep, wrenching cries that came from a place he'd locked away for 7 years. The vision shifted again. He saw Juliana in the moments before her death. But instead of blame in her eyes, he saw love, saw her final prayer, not for herself, but for him. Forgive him, God. He couldn't save me any other way. Forgive him. She never blamed you, Padre Pio whispered. She understood. And she's been praying for you every day since she entered heaven. How can she be in heaven? She took her own life. God judges the heart, not the circumstances. Her death was mercy, not sin. She couldn't bear the weight of living in a world that had become hell. but she made sure her last act was love, telling you that you were forgiven. Antonio felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years, the walls around his soul beginning to dissolve, not breaking violently, but melting like ice in spring sun. And as they melted, he felt grace rushing in, warm, overwhelming, relentless. The families you betrayed? Padre Pio's grip tightened. They're praying for you too, from heaven, because they understand something you don't, that you were as much a victim of that evil as they were. The Nazis broke you and used you as a weapon, but that doesn't make you unredeemable. Padre Pio released Antonio's face and made the sign of the cross. I absolve you, Antonio Salvatore, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Your sins are forgiven, not because you've earned it, but because love never stops pursuing, and you finally stopped running. Antonio collapsed forward, his forehead against the confessional screen, weeping like he'd never wept before. Not tears of despair, but tears of release. When he finally left the church 2 hours later, the sun was fully risen, and for the first time in 7 years, Antonio Salvatore felt light. He didn't feel worthy, he didn't feel clean, but he felt seen, truly, completely, mercifully seen. And that made all the difference. Antonio lived another 37 years. He never became a priest, never did anything the world would call extraordinary. But he spent every day serving in soup kitchens, teaching immigrant children to read, and quietly bearing witness to one truth. No soul is so hidden that God cannot find it. No sin is so dark that grace cannot reach it. And no person is so lost that love cannot bring them home. If this story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever felt too broken to be forgiven, or too stained to be clean, leave a comment. Share your story. You're not alone. And remember, Padre Pio spent his life proving that the souls we think are beyond saving are often the ones God pursues most relentlessly. Subscribe for more true stories of redemption, mercy, and the moments when heaven breaks through our darkness. Because the soul that hides from God is still the soul that God refuses to abandon. This is Antonio's testimony. This is what mercy looks like.